My daughter-in-law called my lasagna dog food in front of investors. She said I was utterly worthless to her new brand and told me to stay out of the kitchen. I'd been cooking at that restaurant for 40 years, arriving every morning at 4 a.m. to prepare the secret sauce that made us famous. So I walked out without saying a word. 3 weeks later, the restaurant collapsed. Sales dropped 70%. Customers left terrible reviews. The staff quit. Because there was something they didn't know. Something I'd protected for 40 years that they could never replicate. Before I tell you how it happened, drop your name and location below. I feature subscribers as characters in every story. And subscribe so you don't miss out. Let me explain how a 65-year-old Italian grandmother used silence as a weapon more powerful than any lawyer could ever be. My name is Rosa Moretti, and I've been cooking since I was 7 years old in my nonna's kitchen in Sicily, learning the ancient art of turning simple ingredients into something that makes people cry with happiness. For 40 years, I was the heart and soul and secret behind Nonna's Table, the most beloved Italian restaurant in this city. The place where politicians proposed marriage and families celebrated every milestone worth remembering. My husband Lorenzo handled the front of the house and managed the books with the careful precision of a mon who'd learned accounting by necessity during the lean years. I handled the kitchen, and what happened in my kitchen wasn't just cooking, it was alchemy, transformation, the conversion of love and time and knowledge into food that people traveled across the city to experience. We didn't just serve meals at Nonna's Table. We served connection. We served tradition. We served a link to something older and more permanent than the fast-moving modern world outside our doors. When Lorenzo passed away 5 years ago from a heart attack that took him in his sleep, peaceful and without warning, I made the decision to give the day-to-day business operations to my son Marco. Marco was 38 then, eager to prove himself, and I thought he was ready to carry forward what his father and I had spent our lives building. But Marco had married Bianca 3 years before Lorenzo passed, and Bianca was all brand and no substance, all image and no understanding of what actually made people return to a restaurant week after week for 40 years. She managed the reservations with an efficiency that felt cold. She demanded what she called Instagrammable dishes that looked beautiful in photographs but tasted like nothing. And she obsessed over remodeling the dining room into what she kept calling a modern dining concept. But Bianca knew absolutely nothing about cooking, nothing about the patience required to develop flavor, nothing about the chemistry of heat and time that transforms ingredients into art. She believed our tradition was alienability holding us back from expansion and franchising, not the asset that had kept our tables full for 4 decades. She saw me, the quiet woman who showed up every morning at 4 to start the day's preparation in silence and solitude, as a worthless relic from a bygone era that needed to be discarded. And that was my secret, the power I had deliberately kept hidden where no one could steal it or diminish it or claim it as their own. The restaurant was famous throughout the city for one thing above all else: the sugo, the secret tomato sauce that was the foundation of every pasta dish, every lasagna, every reputation we'd built over 40 years. No one knew the recipe except me, not Marco, not the sous chefs who'd worked beside me for decades, not even Lorenzo before he passed. It wasn't written down in any cookbook or recipe card. It wasn't stored in any computer file or safe deposit box. It was a precise blend of imported spices and fresh herbs and an exact cooking time and temperature that I carried entirely in my head, protected by memory and deliberate secrecy. I did all the prep work alone every single morning, arriving at 4 when the streets were still dark and empty. And it was my meditative time, my moment of peace before the chaos of service began. It was also my insurance policy, the leverage I never thought I'd need to use, but had protected nonetheless. Because Lorenzo had taught me that trust was beautiful, but documentation was survival. The memory of how the sugo was born came back to me as I watched Bianca being led away in handcuffs, and I thought about Lorenzo's face the first time he tasted what would become our foundation. 30 years ago, we'd been working in a tiny kitchen in a rented space barely big enough for 2 people to stand side by side, testing recipes late into the night while Marco slept in a playpen we'd set up in the corner. "Rosa," Lorenzo had said, trying the sauce I'd been working on for weeks. "Taste this and tell me what you think." He'd taken 1 spoonful and his eye shad filled with tears, not from sadness but from recognition, from tasting something that carried the weight of history and love in every molecule. "This is your nonna's soul in a pot, Rosa," he'd said, his voice breaking slightly. "This is everything she taught you. Everything Sicily means. Everything worth preserving." "Then this will be our foundation," I'd replied, understanding in that moment that we'd created something rare. Lorenzo had gripped my hand tightly, looking at me with an intensity I still remembered decades later. "Promise me something, Rosa," he'd said. "Promise you'll never write this recipe down. Never let it exist anywhere except in your heart and your memory. Keep it safe. Keep it protected. Because if people knew how simple the ingredients were, they'd never understand that the secret isn't what goes in, but how much love and time you give it." I'd promised. And I'd kept that promise for 30 years, protecting the sugo like a mother protects her child. "As long as I'm alive," I told him, "this recipe stays protected and safe." 25 years ago, we'd opened Nona's Table in the location that would become our permanent home, a beautiful corner building with large windows and enough space for 30 tables. Lorenzo had been nervous that morning, pacing the dining room while I worked calmly in the kitchen, preparing for our first customers with the confidence that comes from knowing your work is excellent. The first customer who walked through our door was an older gentleman who ordered the lasagna, and I'd watched from the kitchen doorway as Lorenzo delivered the plate with hands that shook slightly. The man had taken 1 bite, closed his eyes, and sat in silence for a long moment. "This is heaven," he'd finally said, looking up at Lorenzo with wonder in his expression. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My wife learned from her grandmother in Sicily," Lorenzo had replied, his voice filled with pride. Every dish carries that tradition. By the end of that first week, we had a waiting list, and by the end of the first month, food critics were calling us the most authentic Italian restaurant in the city. Lorenzo had found me in the kitchen after we'd closed on that 30th night, and he'd pulled me into his arms without saying anything. "We did it, amore," he'd whispered against my hair. "We built something beautiful, something that will last." "We built a legacy for Marco," I'd replied, thinking about our son and the future we were creating. Lorenzo had tightened his embrace, and I'd felt his heart beating against mine. "We built it together," he'd said, "and it will stand long after we're gone." But Lorenzo had been gone for 5 years now, taken by a heart attack in his sleep, and the legacy we'd built together was being dismantled by a woman who'd never understood what made it valuable in the first place. Lorenzo knew things I hadn't wanted to believe back then, that people would try to take advantage, that they'd see weakness where there was only kindness, that protection required more than just love and good intentions. His words came back to me now with the force of prophecy. "If they ever disrespect you, Rosa, if they ever make you feel worthless, walk away with your head high and let them discover what they've lost." Marco had married Bianca 8 years ago in a ceremony I'd helped plan and cook for, and I remembered standing in the reception hall watching them dance, wondering if I was making up the unease I felt in my stomach. Bianca had been charming that day, beautiful in her white dress, gracious to the guests, and I'd told myself my concerns were just the normal worries of a mother watching her son commit to someone new. The morning after the wedding, Bianca had surprised me by showing up at the restaurant kitchen before the staff arrived, when I was alone doing my prep work. "Mrs. Moretti," she'd said, her voice soft and respectful in a way that had disarmed my defenses. "I want to learn from you. Not the business side, but the heart of what you do. Will you teach me to make Marco's favorite dish?" I've been touched by the request, interpreting it as respect for tradition, as a daughter-in-law who wanted to connect with her husband's family through food. Not the business, the heart, she'd emphasized. Teach me to make his favorite so I can cook it for him when you're not around. She wants to learn, I thought, feeling warmth spread through my chest. She respects what we've built. She wants to be part of this tradition. We'd spent that morning making meatballs together, and I'd shown her how to roll the meat mixture gently between your palms, how to feel when the texture was exactly right. This is love, isn't it? Bianca had said, watching my hands work. Every roll, every movement, it's all about showing love through your hands. Yes, cara, I'd replied, using the Italian endearment that meant dear one. This is how we show love in my family, through food and care and time given freely. When Lorenzo passed away 5 years ago, Bianca had been the one who'd supported me through the funeral, who'd held my arm when I couldn't stand on my own from grief. Nonna Rosa, she'd said at the cemetery, using the title of respect and affection. Lean on me. I'm here for you. You don't have to be strong right now. After the funeral, when everyone else had left and I was sitting alone in the restaurant that felt empty without Lorenzo's presence, Bianca had sat beside me and taken my hand. Lorenzo's legacy is safe with us, she'd said, her voice firm with what I'd believed was commitment. Marco and I will honor everything you and Lorenzo built together. I promise you that. I'd believed her completely in that moment. Believed that she understood the weight of what we'd created. Believed that she'd protect it as fiercely as I would. She understands, I thought, squeezing her hand gratefully. She'll protect what Lorenzo and Amade. She'll help Marco carry it forward. But somewhere between that funeral 5 years ago and the present moment, something had changed in Bianca. Or perhaps I'd simply been too trusting to see what had always been there beneath the surface charm. I saw kindness then, I thought now, watching her being led away in handcuffs. When did it turn to greed? Or was the kindness always just a performance, an investment in gaining my trust? The first warning sign had come about a year after Lorenzo's passing, when Bianca had approached me with what she'd framed as a helpful suggestion about updating the menu. Nonna Rosa, she'd said one afternoon, her tone carefully casual, I've been thinking about the menu and how we might expand our customer base. What about it? I'd asked, already sensing that I wouldn't like where this conversation was heading. We should add more modern dishes, she'd continued, pulling out her phone to show me pictures. Quinoa bowls, kale salads, things that appeal to the health-conscious crowd. This is an Italian restaurant, Bianca, I'd said, keeping my voice level. We serve tradition. We serve what people have been coming here for 40 years to experience. But tradition doesn't pay the bills the way trends do, she'd replied, and I'd heard the edge of impatience in her voice. Trends bring in new customers, younger customers, with disposable income. Our customers come for authenticity, I'd countered. They come because they can't get this food anywhere else, because it's real and honest, and connects them to something meaningful. Bianca had sighed in a way that suggested she thought I was being deliberately difficult. That's a nice sentiment, Nona, but sentiment doesn't show up on profit and loss statements. I'd walked away from that conversation with a knot of unease in my stomach. But I'd told myself it was just generational differences, just the natural tension between preservation and innovation. For months after that first warning, the tension had been like a pot simmering on the back burner, never quite boiling over, but never cooling down either. Bianca had started making changes without consulting me. Small things at first that seemed almost reasonable until you understood the pattern they were creating. The first month, she'd tried to switch from San Marzano tomatoes imported from Italy to cheap, canned alternatives from a bulk supplier, claiming no one would notice the difference. I'd discovered the substitution when I'd opened a can and smelled the metallic tang of tomatoes that had been picked unripe and processed with preservatives. That night, after the restaurant closed, I'd quietly replaced every can she'd ordered with the proper San Marzano tomatoes, paying for them out of my own pension money. The customers would notice, I thought, restocking the pantry in the dark. They might not know what they're tasting, but they'd know something was wrong, and our reputation would suffer. The second month, Bianca had called a staff meeting to announce her new Instagram strategy, and she'd made it clear that she considered my input not just unnecessary, but actively harmful to her vision. The staff had gathered in the dining room after lunch service, and Bianca had stood at the front like a general addressing troops, her laptop open to show examples of what she called aspirational food photography. I'd stood in the back, my arms crossed, listening as she explained her plans. "We need dishes that photograph well on social media," she'd announced to the assembled cooks and servers. "The lasagna, for example, is too brown. It doesn't pop in photos the way modern diners expect." "Lasagna is supposed to be brown, Bianca," I'd said from the back of the room, my voice cutting through her presentation. "It's baked cheese and meat and sauce. That's what the color of properly cooked lasagna looks like." "But it doesn't look appetizing on Instagram," she'd replied, her smile tight and false. "We need color, we need height, we need garnishes that make people want to share the image." "We need flavor, not performance," I'd said, and I'd heard a few of the older staff members murmur agreement. "The food speaks for itself if it's good enough." "Nonna Rosa," she'd said, her tone shifting to something that sounded like pity. "With all respect, you don't understand social media and how modern restaurants build their brands." "I understand food," I'd replied quietly. "I understand that customers pay for what goes in their mouth, not what appears on their phone screen. Customers pay for experiences, and Instagram is part of that experience," she'd shot back. "If we don't adapt to how people consume food media, we'll be left behind. The experience is the taste in their mouth, not the photo on their phone," I'd insisted. "Real food. Food made with love and skill. That's what brings people back week after week." Bianca's face had flushed with frustration, and I'd seen the mask of professional politeness start to slip. "This is exactly why we're stuck in the past," she'd said, her voice rising slightly. "This resistance to change, this obsession with doing things the old way just because that's how we've always done them? We're not stuck," I'd said calmly, though my heart was pounding. "We're rooted, we're grounded in something real and authentic." "Rooted sounds like a nice word for stubborn and outdated," Bianca had snapped, abandoning any pretense of respect. "Outdated?" I'd replied, my voice still quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "Our reservations are booked 3 weeks in advance. We have customers who've been coming here for 20 years. Because of the location, not the food," she'd said dismissively. "We're in a prime spot. That's what fills the tables." "Then why do customers ask for my lasagna by name?" I'd asked. "Why do they request the table by the window so they can watch me work in the kitchen? Why do they bring their children and grandchildren to taste the same dishes they ate on their first date?" Bianca had opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, realizing she'd pushed too far in front of the staff. The meeting had ended in comfortable silence, and I'd returned to my kitchen feeling the weight of what was coming. The fourth month, Bianca had begun presenting renovation proposals to Marco, plans to transform the warm, intimate dining room into what she kept calling a modern dining concept. She'd shown me the designs one afternoon, spreading glossy architectural renderings across the kitchen prep table while I was trying to work. "Look at this, Nonna," she'd said, her voice bright with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely couldn't see what they were about to destroy. "We knock out this wall, create an open kitchen concept, install industrial lighting, replace the wood floors with polished concrete." "You want to destroy the intimacy," I'd said, looking at designs that turned our restaurant into something cold and impersonal. "That wood floor has been here for 40 years. People love the warmth of this space." "Warmth doesn't photograph well," she'd replied. "We need clean lines. We need a space that looks expensive and exclusive. We need a space where people feel welcome and comfortable," I'd countered, "where they can bring their families and feel like they're being invited into our home." "That's old thinking, Nonna," she'd said, rolling up the designs with barely concealed impatience. Modern diners want to be impressed. They want to feel like they're part of something exclusive and cutting edge. They want to feel fed and cared for, I'd said quietly. They want to leave with full bellies and warm hearts. That's what we've been giving them for 40 years. The confrontation that changed everything came during what Bianca had called the new menu tasting, an event she'd organized to pitch her modernization plans to potential investors. She'd invited 3 well-dressed people with expensive watches and calculating eyes, entrepreneurs who saw restaurants as investment vehicles rather than places where human beings gathered to share meals and conversation. I'd known the event was happening, but Bianca had made it clear my presence in the kitchen during the tasting would be, as she'd put it, counterproductive to the narrative she was building. Still, I'd prepared a small tray of my traditional lasagna that morning, the recipe that had made our reputation, because I'd understood that what was at stake wasn't just money, but the soul of everything Lorenzo and I had built. The investors had arrived at 2 p.m, and I'd watched from the kitchen doorway as Bianca had seated them at the best table, the one by the window with the view of the street. She'd been dressed in an expensive suit, her hair perfectly styled, playing the role of the modern restaurateur with practiced ease. "Gentlemen," she'd announced, her voice carrying that particular enthusiasm that comes from people who are selling something. "Thank you for coming today to see the future of what will soon be a regional chain of modern Italian bistros." I'd felt my stomach turn at the word chain, at the idea of replicating what Lorenzo and I had built as if it were a factory product rather than a living tradition. Bianca had gestured to a server who'd brought out her version of our signature dish, and I'd recognized immediately that it was frozen, pre-made lasagna that had been reheated and plated. "This is our signature dish, reimagined for scalability," she'd explained to the investors. "Low labor cost, consistent quality across multiple locations, and a profit margin that's 3 times higher than the traditional preparation." I'd waited while one of the investors had cut into the lasagna, watched his face as he chewed slowly. "It's fine," he'd said diplomatically. "A bit bland, perhaps, but acceptable for a fast casual concept." That's when I'd stepped forward with my tray, moving quietly from the kitchen doorway to their table. "And this is the original," I'd said, placing my handmade lasagna beside Bianca's frozen version. The investors deserved to taste both before making their decision. Bianca's face had gone rigid with anger, but she'd maintained her professional smile. "Nona, we didn't ask for your input today," she'd said, her voice tight. "This meeting is about the future, not the past." "The investors should understand what they're investing in," I'd replied calmly. "They should know what made this restaurant famous before they decide to change it." The second investor, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper suit, had tried both versions, and I'd watched her expression shift from polite interest to genuine surprise. "Oh," she'd said, after tasting my lasagna. "Oh, this is something completely different. This is extraordinary." "That's the old recipe," Bianca had said quickly, trying to regain control of the narrative. "It's too expensive to scale, too labor-intensive to maintain consistent quality. It costs more because it's made with love and real ingredients," I'd said, meeting Bianca's eyes. "Because someone wakes up at 4 a.m. to prepare it properly." "Love doesn't show up on a balance sheet, Nona," Bianca had replied, her mask of politeness finally cracking. "And nostalgia doesn't pay the rent." "Neither does an empty dining room," I'd said quietly. "And that's what you'll have when people discover you've replaced quality with convenience." Bianca had picked up my plate then, holding it between 2 fingers as if it might contaminate her perfectly manicured hands. "This," she'd announced to the investors, her voice dripping with contempt, "this is exactly why we must evolve beyond the founders' outdated methods." Then she'd done something I never would have believed if I hadn't witnessed it myself. "It's greasy, old, and frankly, my dog wouldn't eat this," she'd said, and she'd tossed the napkin she'd tasted from onto the floor. The truth is, Nona's taste buds are gone. She's simply worthless to this new brand. She needs to stay out of the kitchen and let professionals handle the future. The room had erupted in nervous laughter from the investors and the staff members who'd been hovering nearby. People who understood that Bianca controlled their employment and that laughing was safer than defending me. My son Marco, who'd been standing in the doorway to the office, had let out a small, pathetic laugh that destroyed something fundamental inside me. My grandson Leo, who was home from culinary school for the week, had been standing beside his father, and I'd watched him stare at his hands, unable to defend me in front of his mother. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene that would give Bianca the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. I simply walked to my locker in the back hallway, retrieved my prized set of Italian cooking knives that had been my Nona's gift to me 50 years ago, and untied my signature floral apron. I hung the apron neatly on its hook, the way I'd done every night for 40 years, and I walked toward the back door without looking at anyone. Good, I'd heard Bianca chirp behind me. The kitchen is finally clean. Now we can move forward with people who understand modern restaurant operations. I stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, and the feeling that washed over me wasn't rage or despair, but a chilling, crystalline clarity. My love, my sacrifice, my very worth had been judged and dismissed by someone who'd never understood what created value in the first place. And in that moment of perfect clarity, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The feeling wasn't anger burning hot, but something colder and more controlled. The kind of calm that comes when you finally understand the full scope of a problem and know you have the tools to solve it. My hands were steady as I drove home. My heart was beating normally, but my mind was working with the sharp precision I'd learned from 40 years of managing a kitchen, where timing and accuracy meant the difference between excellence and failure. Lorenzo's words came back to me as I parked in front of my apartment. Words he'd spoken years ago when we'd been dealing with a supplier who'd tried to cheat us. If they ever disrespect you, Rosa, if they ever make you feel worthless, walk away with your head high and let them discover what they've lost. Then, when they realize what they've done, you'll have the choice of whether to forgive or to let them face the consequences of their own actions. That night, I didn't weep or rage or call friends for sympathy. I called Arthur Chen, Lorenzo's old friend who'd handled all our legal matters for 30 years. "Arthur," I'd said when he'd answered, my voice perfectly steady, "I need to see you tonight, and I need you to bring every piece of documentation related to Nona's table." "Rosa," he'd said, concern clear in his voice. "What's happened? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I'd replied. "But I need to pull every legal lever we have, and I need to do it immediately." I'd spent 3 hours in Arthur's office that night, and what we'd reviewed had made Arthur's eyes grow wider with each document we'd examined. The first document had been the trademark registration for Nona's Table, filed 40 years ago when Lorenzo and I had first opened the restaurant. "Rosa," Arthur had said, studying the registration certificate. "This trademark is registered in your personal name, not the company's name." "I know," I'd replied. Lorenzo insisted on it when we first filed. He said I should always maintain personal control of the brand we were building. "So they're operating under your trademark without proper licensing," Arthur had said slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "They're using your intellectual property without permission." The second document had been even more powerful, the property deed and lease arrangement for the restaurant building. "You sold the building to the company on a land contract," Arthur had said, reading through the legal language, "but you maintained the underlying deed and lease rights in your personal name." "Lorenzo set it up that way," I'd explained. "He said I should always own the ground they stood on, that it would protect me if anything ever went wrong." "Rosa," Arthur had said, looking up from the papers with something like awe, "they're not owners of this building, they're your tenants, and you can terminate their lease under the right circumstances." The third element wasn't a document, but an absence. The fact that the sugo recipe had never been written down, never been shared, never existed anywhere except in my memory. "And the sauce," Arthur had said, "the famous sugo that everyone comes to Nona's table to taste. It's a trade secret, I'd said. Never written down, never shared. Protected by my silence and my memory. Arthur had sat back in his chair, shaking his head slowly. Rosa, he'd said, you didn't just bake cookies and make pasta for 40 years. You built a legal fortress, layer by layer, protection upon protection. I built a future for my family, Arthur, I'd replied. Now I have to defend the foundations of what Lorenzo and I created together. We'd prepared 3 separate legal documents that night, each one a carefully aimed weapon designed to protect what I'd built and to demonstrate the consequences of dismissing someone as worthless. The first was a cease and desist letter regarding trademark infringement, formally notifying Marco and Bianca that they were using my personal trademark without permission, and demanding they immediately stop using the name Nona's Table. The second was a notice of lease determination, beginning the formal legal process of evicting the restaurant from the building I owned. The third was a notification that the sugo recipe was a protected trade secret, and any attempt to reverse engineer or imitate it would result in a lawsuit under the Uniform Trade Secrets Act. Arthur's hands had been shaking slightly as he'd printed the final versions of each document. Rosa, he'd said, this is going to destroy the restaurant. You understand that. They can't operate without the name, without the building, without your sauce. I know, I'd replied calmly. But I didn't destroy it, Arthur. They did, when they called me worthless and dismissed 40 years of my life's work as garbage. The documents will be served to Tate tomorrow morning, Arthur had said, just as they're opening for the day. Perfect, I'd replied, standing to leave. Thank you, Arthur, for being Lorenzo's friend and mine. The next morning, I woke at 4 out of pure habit, my body clock trained by 40 years of pre-dawn kitchen work. But instead of driving to the restaurant, as I'd done every day for decades, I stayed in my small apartment kitchen and made myself a perfect cappuccino using the espresso machine Lorenzo had bought me for our 30th anniversary. I knew what was happening at the restaurant, could picture it in my mind with perfect clarity. Marco would be arriving around 6, shouting at the sous chef about prep work that should have been finished. Bianca would be snapping orders at the servers, arranging tables for the lunch rush, completely confident that their modernization plans were moving forward. But they wouldn't have the sugo, because the sugo only existed when I created it. And I was sitting in my apartment drinking coffee and waiting for the consequences to begin. My absence created a vacuum, a black hole where the soul of the restaurant used to be. At 9 in the morning, my phone began vibrating with frantic calls from Marco. I looked at the screen, saw his name flashing, and I silenced the phone without answering. At 11:30, I knew the lunch rush would be starting, and I could imagine the chaotic scramble in the kitchen as they tried to serve pasta without the famous sauce that made every dish special. Bianca, in her contempt for tradition, had probably just thrown dried herbs into canned tomatoes and hoped no one would notice the difference. But people would notice, because taste doesn't lie, and the loyal customers who'd been coming to Nona's Table for years would immediately recognize that something essential was missing. My heart ached for those customers, for the people who trusted us to feed them properly. But I reminded myself that this pain was temporary and necessary. At 12:30 in the afternoon, Arthur's junior associate delivered the certified mail to the restaurant, and I imagined Marco's face as he signed the receipt and opened the envelope. The letters were cold and technical, monuments to legal precision, each one a separate death blow to the restaurant's ability to function. The first letter demanded immediate cessation of all use of the trademark Nona's Table on the grounds of trademark infringement. The second letter provided notice of lease termination, beginning the formal eviction process from the building. The third letter formally notified them that the sugo recipe was a protected trade secret, and any attempt to reverse engineer or imitate it would result in legal action. Marco called my phone immediately, his voice hysterical and breaking. "Mom," he'd shouted into my voicemail. "This is insane. You can't just take the name away. We have reservations booked for weeks. We have a staff that depends on us." I'd let the call go to voicemail, erased it without listening to the whole message because I wasn't interested in excuses or panic. I was interested in consequences, in the natural results of dismissing someone as worthless without understanding what made them valuable. Bianca, I learned later from one of the servers who called to ask if I needed help, had gone into a fit of uncontrolled rage. The old witch she'd apparently screamed, pacing the dining room. She was just a cook. How could she own the building? How could she control the trademark? She hadn't bothered to read the original lease documents or the business formation papers, hadn't done basic due diligence about who actually owned what. Her only value had been in her superficial management skills, and now her management had driven the business directly into a legal minefield she didn't have the tools to escape. The aftermath was swift and brutal, in a way that even I hadn't fully anticipated. The restaurant had to hang a handwritten sign on the door that read, "Closed for emergency renovation," though everyone in the neighborhood knew that emergency renovations meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. But the truth spread faster than any official statement could control, carried by disappointed customers and gossiping staff members who understood exactly what had happened. Yelp and Google Maps instantly lit up with terrible reviews from the lunch crowd who'd eaten there that day. "The food has no soul. 1 star," one review had read. "Nona must be sick or gone, because this tastes like metal and sadness. Not like the food I've been eating here for 10 years. "What happened?" another review had screamed in all capital letters. The lasagna was always perfect. Today, it was completely inedible. "I'll never come back, and I'm telling everyone I know to stay away." New management clearly destroyed the magic, a third review had stated bluntly. The sauce tasted like it came from Aachen. The pasta was overcooked. This isn't the Nona's table I've loved for 20 years. The local food critics, who'd been kind and generous to us for decades, published scathing updates about the restaurant's sudden decline. The consensus was universal and damning. The magic was gone. The soul had been removed. Whatever made Nona's table special had disappeared overnight. Without the trademark, the restaurant was forced to operate under a hastily chosen new name, the Corner Bistro, which sounded generic and forgettable compared to the warm invitation of Nona's table. Sales evaporated almost immediately, dropping by 70% in the first week alone. The staff, who relied on tips from a busy lunch rush and packed dinner service, started leaving to find work at restaurants where the customers were actually happy. They knew the truth before Marco Folly understood it. The money was drying up because the quality had dropped to zero, and no amount of Instagram marketing could fix food that tasted like sadness. Marco, cornered and desperate, and finally seeing the real face of his wife's modernization plans, started to crack under the pressure. I didn't gloat or celebrate, because there was nothing joyful about watching my son's dreams collapse, even if those dreams had been built on disrespecting everything I'd created. Instead, I started working on building something new, something that would carry the tradition forward in the right hands. My first secret meeting was with my grandson Leo, who'd been quietly visiting my apartment in the evenings, sneaking away from his parents' house to see me. Leo hadn't run away from home. He'd simply chosen his mentor, chosen the person who actually understood what made food worth eating. "Nona," he'd said one evening, sitting at my small kitchen table, "I want to learn the recipe, the real sugo that makes everything special. I want to carry it forward the right way." I'd looked at my grandson, at the sincerity in his young face, at the passion for cooking that reminded me so much of myself at his age. "It's yours, Leo," I'd said, pulling a worn leather-bound notebook from a high shelf. But we don't start at Nona's table. We don't try to reclaim something that's been poisoned. We start small and honest and mobile. We start fresh. We'd used my pension savings, the money Marco thought I'd spent on myself over the years, to purchase a modest but cheerful red food truck. I'd called it Nona and Leo's Rolling Kitchen, and our menu was beautifully simple. The legendary lasagna, perfect meatballs, and one rotating seasonal pasta dish. While Leo and I had been planning our food truck logistics, Arthur had hired an independent accounting auditor to review all of Nona's table's financial records. The eviction process required me to establish the company's insolvency as a legal reason for terminating the lease. And what the auditor discovered had been far worse than simple mismanagement. Arthur had called me late one evening, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Rosa," he'd said, "you need to come to my office immediately and see what we found." The audit report had been devastating in its clarity, showing massive discrepancies in what Bianca had called the remodeling fund. She'd inflated construction invoices by over 300%, creating fake billing from contractors and diverting hundreds of thousands of dollars into hidden accounts. The renovations she'd claimed to be planning for the restaurant had never been real. They'd been a cover story for systematically looting the business to pay for her personnel expenses. Designer clothes, exotic vacations, a secret high-stakes gambling habit that had apparently consumed tens of thousands of dollars. All of it paid for with money stolen from the restaurant Lorenzo and I had built. Marco's gentle compliance and his unwillingness to question his wife had facilitated grand theft. I took the audit report and the photographic evidence of Bianca's spending, credit card statements showing purchases at luxury stores and gambling websites, directly to Arthur. "Marco still sees her as his wife," I'd said, looking at the evidence of betrayal spread across Arthur's desk. "I see her as a thief who needs to face criminal prosecution." Arthur had nodded grimly, his lawyer's mind already working through the next steps. "We file for criminal charges of embezzlement," he'd said. "We do it now, before she has time to hide more evidence or flee." The final confrontation had been set for a Tuesday afternoon, and I'd walked into the disgraced restaurant, now operating as the Corner Bistro, with Arthur and a police detective beside me. Marco had been sitting alone at a table near the kitchen, staring at an empty cash register, his face a roadmap of despair and defeat. He'd looked up when we'd entered, and his expression had shifted from confusion to recognition to something that looked like relief. "Mom," he choked out, standing on unsteady legs. "The bank is calling in our loans. We're finished. We have nothing left." I'd put the audit report on the table in front of him, the pages of evidence documenting his wife's crimes. "You were finished the day you allowed that woman to call me worthless," I'd said quietly. "The day you laughed when she said my food was garbage." Bianca had rushed in from the office then, her face flushed with anger, shouting about legal loopholes and her rights. "You can't do this," she'd screamed. "This is my life. This is my restaurant. You're just a spiteful old woman trying to destroy what I built." Marco had grabbed the audit report then, his hands shaking as he'd read the evidence of theft and betrayal. "You stole from us," he'd said, his voice breaking. "From my father's legacy, from my mother's work, from everything our family built. You were too weak to earn a real living," Bianca had screamed back, all pretense of civility abandoned. "I had to take it. I had to secure our future, because you were content to just serve pasta like peasants." I'd stepped back, allowing the truth to consume them both, because I didn't need to speak. The paperwork spoke for me, the numbers didn't lie, and the evidence was overwhelming. The detective had stepped forward then, placing a hand on Bianca's shoulder. "Ms. Everson," he'd said formally, "you're under arrest for grand larceny and embezzlement." Bianca's shriek of disbelief and fury had been the last sound I'd heard before I'd quietly turned and walked out of the restaurant. The beautiful place Lorenzo and I had built was officially a crime scene, and I had no desire to watch it be processed like evidence. Marco had filed for divorce immediately, and the bankruptcy proceedings had been swift and inevitable. He'd lost everything, not because of me, but because he'd valued comfort and a shallow image over integrity and the love of his family. 6 weeks after Bianca's arrest, a queue stretched down the block in the city's main square on a sunny Saturday morning. The source of the commotion was a bright red food truck, Nona and Leo's Rolling Kitchen, with steam rising from the service window and the scent of basil and garlic and slow-cooked tomatoes filling the air. Leo, his face beaming with pride and joy, had been handing out portions of the famous lasagna to customers who'd been waiting for over an hour. The customers, my old loyalists, who'd followed the news and tracked me down through social media, had been cheering and laughing and even crying. "This is it, Nona," they'd shouted. "The real thing, the magic is back. This is what we've been missing." One woman in her 70s had taken a bite and burst into tears, pressing her hand to her heart. "My husband proposed to me at Nona's table 40 years ago," she'd said. "This tastes exactly like that night. Like love and hope and everything beautiful." My critics had judged my value and found me worthless. But the market had delivered the final verdict, and it was absolute and unambiguous. One quiet afternoon, after the last customer had left and Leo and I had cleaned the truck until it gleamed, we'd sat together in my small kitchen. Marco had been struggling to rebuild his life, living in a rented room and working as a line cook at a chain restaurant, paying off the debts his ex-wife had incurred. He wasn't a villain anymore, just a tragic figure learning brutal lessons about loyalty and respect. I'd taken out my most cherished possession then, a blank, leather-bound notebook with creamy pages that had been waiting for this moment. I'd opened it to the first page and begun to write, transcribing from memory the exact proportions of every spice, every temperature shift, every secret timing of the legendary sugo. It was the first time in 50 years that I'd ever committed the recipe to paper. I'd slid the notebook across the table to Leo, whose hands had been trembling as he'd picked it up. "I never wrote this down, Leo," I'd said, watching his face, "because I feared it would be stolen, feared it would be misused for profit without respect or understanding." Leo had looked at the carefully written recipe, at the annotations and the little drawings I'd made to illustrate technique. "But now it's yours," I'd continued, feeling something release in my chest. "A recipe is more than ingredients and temperatures. It's love and respect, and the boundary between the worth you create and the worthlessness others try to place upon you." Leo had looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Nona," he'd whispered. "I won't let you down. I promise I'll protect this and honor it." I'd stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that had witnessed so much history. "Good," I'd replied. The dignity of my silence finally translated into quiet, profound victory. "Now let's get ready for tomorrow's market, because we have people who are counting on us to feed them properly. So I'm asking you now, if you were in my position, would you have chosen to completely burn down the family business like I did? Or would you have tried to negotiate and sell the secret recipe to Marco? Do you believe Marco deserves a second chance after his silence enabled Bianca's cruelty? Or was his betrayal unforgivable? Leave your thoughts in the comments below because I genuinely want to know how you would have handled this situation. And if this story of finding worth and claiming your name resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more stories about standing up for yourself when the world tells you you're worthless. Thanks for listening to mine.